Thousands of unexplained infant deaths, missing children, forced labour, the ripping apart of families, immoral medical trials, mass unmarked graves, young women, many of them children themselves, incarcerated because they were pregnant, sometimes non-consensually, the victims of rape and incest, throwing children and women into situations of abuse. So many unimaginable horrors were perpetuated against some of the most vulnerable in our society. If British forces had committed these atrocities, there would be unending calls for justice. If we learned about these acts of evil in another country, we would rightly condemn the regimes. But because it happened here, because it was government policy perpetuated by the church, because it is our cruel humanity, nothing. For decades, survivors were denied even the acknowledgement of what happened to them. When we look at the entirety of the crimes, abuses, and human rights violations, it is almost unimaginable in its scale, brutality, and immorality. It was an intentional system designed to contain and punish single mothers. It penalised and abused them for being pregnant, for being women, for being travellers, for being disabled, for being a person of colour. This was state policy and church strategy. Each government between the 1930s and 1990s had a part to play in it, and history is clear on what happened to the few people who tried to stand up for the rights of women and children. Control, fear, and silence were all central to this system. Sparse records were kept of infant deaths, illegal adoptions, and incarcerations because they knew that it was wrong. Then, religious leaders, state officials, and government ministers collaborated to hide and deny the truth for decades. These cover-ups became codified in law and in practice. At all stages, these crimes and human rights abuses were intentional, and the denial of justice, no access to information or recognition was part of the same system protecting itself. Thousands of unnatural deaths are still not being investigated. Whole groups of survivors have been denied even the dignity of a meaningful apology, not to mention any form of redress. Information on illegal adoptions is still being covered up. On paper, this government looks like a different one. The government that introduced the Adoption Information and Tracing legislation and the Burials Act. From its press releases, it looks good. But once you dig only a little bit deeper, it is clear that it is just as committed to putting barriers in the way of justice and accountability and to abetting those responsible. This government and this minister have ignored the pleas of survivors again and again and again. The glaring errors and misuse of testimony in the Commission's report is willfully ignored and even defended. The Institutional Burials Act is designed to ensure that Tuam will be the only mass grave ever excavated. The Birth Information and Tracing Bill comes with barriers and limitations. All the same time, the religious orders and pharmaceutical companies are allowed to get away with murder. This government continues to facilitate the cover-up of crimes and human rights abuses, and most cynically and callously, it does it in full knowledge. The minister knows the long history. He knows what survivors are asking for. He knows what the public wants and clearly seems to not care. His mantra seems to be just enough for a good headline, just enough to look good, just enough to misrepresent the reality. This is just another form of abuse. Survivors are still being refused their rights. The basic tenets of our justice system have not been applied. Suspicious deaths, disappearance, sexual assault are all going uninvestigated on purpose. The Minister's proposed redress scheme is the latest example of his approach to the issue. It's designed to give as little compensation to a smaller number of survivors as possible. The Minister is excluding people who spent less than 6 months in institutions as children, people who suffered forced family separation, people subjected to non-consensual medical trials. The Minister is disregarding the wishes of survivors, international human rights bodies and the Children's Committee. Our motion today is based on what many survivors have asked for, what human rights experts have said and what the Irish people want. We are calling on the government to correct the findings of the Mother and Baby Homes Commission report, to pay compensation proportionate to the suffering caused, and finally, to hold the Church and the state to account. No one I talk to disagrees with this. These are the most basic elements needed for any form of justice, yet this government is refusing to do any of them. The most sickening aspect of the Mother and Baby Homes report were the findings that exonerated the Church and state by claiming that all of society was to blame. Because, of course, if everyone is to blame, then no one is to blame, and survivors can never get justice. This is a deep insult to those who suffered and still suffer today. It gives the government cover to push through a pathetic redress scheme that excludes so many survivors and ignores the reality of illegal adoptions and other crimes. What about now? When those same people are being denied basic justice again, will you blame society today, Minister? Is it the fault of the people watching today, or people in Blanchardstown or people in West Cork? Are they to blame for this failure? When there is an inquiry into all of this in years to come, and that inquiry might say, oh, well, those were the times, I want this debate to be on the Dáil record. I don't know what the tactic of the week will be by government. Is it to pass the motion and ignore it? Is it to vote it down? You might let us know in your reply, Minister. Ultimately, though, it seems clear that this motion won't achieve what we want it to. But at the very least, I hope people know that so many of us tried, and I want people to know that society does not agree with the government on this. This utter disgrace is just on you. You know the Commission on Mother and Baby Homes report findings were inaccurate, Minister, because you called for an independent review. Then you just quietly abandoned it. The High Court case last year revealed the serious flaws in the report, not to mention the evaluation from the Special Rapporteur on Child Protection and other human rights experts. And that flawed report is the justification for your disgraceful and exclusionary redress scheme. Minister, you know what survivors have gone through. You know the scale and breadth of abuses perpetuated against women, children and infants by the state and the Church. And yet you are imposing arbitrary time limits with no basis in evidence, excluding people who suffered forced family separation, precluding those boarding out, and choosing to deny the harm caused by forced labour, mistreatment, racial abuse, and so much more. Your own consultation with the survivors and others, the Oak Report, called for universal, inclusive scheme which recognised the loss of the mother-child bond and relationship, which was reported to be the cause of widespread trauma and mental health issues for many survivors, harm caused by psychological, physical, and sexual abuse, including degrading and dehumanising treatment endured in the homes, unvetted family placements through adoptions, fostering or boarding out was also clearly identified, as well as racial and ethnic discrimination and non-consensual inclusion in medical trials. Moreover, the Human Rights Committee and Special Rapporteurs have sought an inclusive scheme compensating all survivors of this system with the removal of the time criteria and the legal waiver. And somehow, you've decided to stick with the criteria of time spent in an institution. It is unbelievable. Today, the Social Democrats are again joining the vast majority of Irish people in asking for accountability. Is any religious order or pharmaceutical company going to pay a cent to this scheme? Why are you not pursuing them? Last week, we learned you're still in negotiations with religious orders, in negotiations with bodies that perpetuated horrific abuses, profited from vulnerable people, and conducted unauthorised medical trials. Why are you not seizing property? Where are the arrests? The religious orders in particular are responsible for mass graves around the country. They are complicit in illegal adoptions and illegal vaccine trials and profiting from them. Your response? To talk with them? To go cap in hand as if it's the 1950s? In your reply, Minister, can you please explain why you cynically and cruelly commissioned a consultation with survivors only to ignore their wishes? Can you outline why you are purposefully disregarding the UN Human Rights Committees and several special rapporteurs they have called for all survivors to receive compensation, the removal of time-based restrictions and the removal of any form of waiver? In other debates, you've misrepresented the position of UN human rights experts, but their calls are black and white on this. Can you elaborate on why you've rejected the recommendations of the Children's Committee, recommendations based on our detailed engagement with survivors, their advocates and human rights experts? Can you tell us why you're not pursuing religious orders and pharmaceutical companies for every penny that they owe survivors and their relatives? And finally, can you state for the record why you are committed to continuing the systematic abuse of these people?